Good afternoon. If we're going to go ahead and get started on the public safety meeting today. We got one bill on the agenda. It's House Bill 72 by Representative James Mills. And Representative Mills, if you're ready, we're ready for you.
Test, yes. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to present House Bill 72 to the committee. And I understand that there is a committee sub which I have. So you'll be reading. I'll be reading from LC 3520660S. That's up in the top right-hand corner of your bill. It's just a minor change, and I'll be glad to clarify that in just a moment. All right. House Bill 72 deals with if you are a legal resident and a permanent resident in Georgia, this bill would require you, if you're a permanent resident, to take the driver's license test in English. Right now you can take it up to, I think, 14 different languages, and this bill is crafted such on lines 13 through 16. It states that the written test, or you can also take it orally if you request that the test be given to you orally. That test will be administered in English. However, if you are here in this country on a visa, then you can request that it be taken in one of the 14 languages that we offer, that it be given. You can do that for a period of up to 10 years. After that period of 10 years, if you have been here on a visa and you're not yet a legal resident or a permanent resident, then you would be required to take it in English like everyone else. So why the need for an English driver's license test? All of our signage on our sides of our roads are in English. None are in foreign languages. All of our signage when you're going 55 or 70 miles an hour down the expressway, and we have many new signs now that are not just signs and symbols with English underneath them, they're digital. And as you're going down the expressway, the sign may say something like this: Amber Alert, looking for an 11-year-old girl in a red Chevy 1978 van, or whatever. Or it may read, both lanes closed up ahead due to icy bridge. Or it may read, bridge out up ahead, please exit off the next ramp. I mean, anything you want to type into that digital sign overhead is in English. And I certainly see it as a public safety issue. There are those who want to turn this bill into something that it's not. And it actually, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, those of you that know me, I have to be honest and tell you that it grieves me when I read people write things and say that James Mills does not like a certain class of people. Those of you that know me, that is the farthest thing from the truth. However, I do believe that public safety is important, and I believe this bill is important. It's been falsely stated by groups, some of which are here today, and they're going to speak to you. They said that this bill was defeated last year. That is not true. And I take issue with those who want to make false statements in the press or to this committee. What happened last year with the driver's license test to be administered in English was it had an amendment put on it. It passed both the House and the Senate. But it had an amendment put on it that dealt with internet driver's schools. When you get a DUI or something like that, and you have to go back to take a driver certification class. And that was put on there. If you remember, and you were here, there was a huge debate between should we offer this only at brick and mortar driver schools or should it be allowed on the internet to be offered. That's what stalled that bill. In the waning hours of the last night, both the Senate agreed to take that amendment off, and then it passed the Senate, and it came back to the House. The only reason it didn't pass was because we ran out of time. It passed by a wide margin in the House with just this language that you've got before you on it right on your bill right now. The only slight change is the change that's made in the substitute, and that is on line 37. And the existing bill on line 37, it read, well, 36, it said for a total combined period of 10 years. And the substitute just further clarifies it, makes it a little bit clearer by saying for a total combined period of more than 10 years. So in other words, they can keep renewing that visa and keep getting their driver's license test offered in other languages if you're not a permanent resident for up to 10 years. But if you are a permanent resident in the state of Georgia and we pass this bill, then you will be required to take the test in English. And, Mr. Chairman, I'll be glad to try to answer any questions that the committee or you may have.
Thank you, Representative Mills. Are there any questions from the committee? Representative Maddox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Who takes the exam orally, and how would this change that? I mean, is an oral examination administered in 14 different languages?
No, sir, it's not. The oral exam is only administered in English. That's the way it's always been. Anyone, if you are a legal citizen, of course, you know in Georgia we passed some while back, if you're not a legal citizen, you can't get a license in Georgia anyway. Mm-hmm. But if you request a driver's license test to be given to you orally, then they have to do it. And they simply read the questions. They do not clarify any of the questions or expound on them. They just have someone who reads it, and the person has to answer. And that is for a segment of society which may not know how to read and write. They tell me over in driver services that there's approximately about maybe 5,000 people who ask for it to be given orally. That's not a year. That's not broken down whether or not it's a language barrier or whether or not they just want to have it administered orally. And so, proponents, those who are opposed to this bill, one of the things they would like to say is they will say, well, you allow an exemption for those who are illiterate by asking for the oral test. Mm. Well, we've got less than 5,000 people taking that test. If you increase your odds and you have 10,000 people taking that test who can't read those road signs, then naturally you're also going to increase the statistics of accidents that could and will take place due to not being able to read an English digital sign overhead, which may say bridge out up ahead.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing the bill. I know you're taking some heat for it, but I circled one of the signs here that says school bus stop ahead on your little sheet that you printed out because it reminds me of a conversation that I had with a DMV worker who 2 years ago had a conversation while I was in one of the offices. He administers the driving portions of the examination, and I think I understand now, you can have an affidavit that says you've had so many hours of driving experience, and then you qualify to sit to take your driving examination. And he was given that to a young man, and they were riding down a frontage road because we were talking about this issue because I wanted to know what he felt about it. And he told me about this real life situation where they're going down the road, and then all of a sudden, kid slams on brakes, the car behind him veers off into the ditch to go around him, and he's gathering his wits about him. It shocked him, of course, and he didn't know. And then he realizes what had happened. He looks over, and there was a sign on the side of the road that said school bus stop ahead, and the only word that the gentleman recognized was stop. So he did. And that's a real life factual occurrence that happened, and it's a danger, it's a threat. So appreciate you bringing it. I do think the oral examinations, it kind of flickered a little spark in my mind that kind of, if we're getting to the being able to read and comprehend what the what signs say to be safer. That I mean, I don't know what you do about that. I realize the number's small, but maybe an issue there that needs to be tended to.
Well, Representative Maddox, if I may, the last thing we want to do is to penalize somebody for being poor and illiterate,
Sure.
not being able. I know you feel that as well. There is a huge difference between someone who has grown up in Georgia, even though they can't read, and someone who has never been in Georgia and who doesn't read any English. Signs are more easily recognized. There are those who oppose this bill who would say that, people who come here, they can read the symbols, but it's not always symbols that we're talking about, as you've illustrated. Mm-hmm. And they will also tell you that there are no statistics on more wrecks. That's because law officers are not allowed to keep those statistics. In Texas, there was a law officer who started reporting traffic accidents by saying non-English speaking person involved. He was threatened with lawsuits and told by the department that was against the law and he could not do that. So we may never have those statistics on that, but our international airports are recognizing the importance of this with traffic controllers, and I know this bill doesn't deal with international airports, but it is along the same lines. By March of this year, every airport in the world is going to English only, and that is just so for public safety.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Neal.
If I would, I actually worked for the Department of Driver Services in that very same capacity, actually off the frontage road, actually at the Forest Park location. I can attest to all the agencies, all the DDS agencies are understaffed, and I know that as far as the oral tests for the persons that can't read or what have you, it's not a matter of illiteracy as far as can't understand simple things such as stop and go, those kind of things. That's not the type of illiteracy you deal with. Like when I gave the oral exam to persons, it was usually an elderly person who didn't have the opportunities for schooling and things like that. So the intricate words within the actual test, they couldn't understand. But as far as bridge closed, that kind of stuff, of course, like you mentioned, because they have been here in Georgia, they know what those things are. But it's the intricacies of the verbiage that's used in the actual written test that's difficult for those persons. But at the same time, when a person that is a worker of DDS has to give when they have to give a test in another language, one, they can't explain much, if anything, to them because they don't know the language they speak. Two, they can't help them during the test either. So it's kind of a boundary on both sides. It makes it kind of hard. And then sometimes we've had people that we come in, we give them one test, and like I think the Asian language has a few different variations like Mandarin, this, that, and the other. And then you give them one test for one of the Asian languages. Well, no, I speak this. And then they'll come back and say, if we can find someone that can interpret something, they'll be like, well, you all had this wrong in the test and this wrong, and this is a difference between these. So it's hard to even facilitate a good test in another language due to the barrier that we don't have all of those different languages inside the DDS centers to help them out. So I just wanted to say that.
Well, it's an excellent point. There are 9 other states who do this as well, and they administer the driver's license test in English.
Mm-hmm. But I want to say, I think it's not a matter. It's easy to say it's a race thing, but people don't understand. Those DDS centers are, one, they're understaffed, and trying to give another language is very hard. Regardless of race, it's hard, and sometimes they're operating off 5-6 man teams in there. And I think everybody's seen the lines at the DDS centers wrapped around the corner. That's just my view on it.
Representative Frazier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My light was off, so I thought you had turned me off.
I won't do that.
Thank you. Representative Mills, the question I was going to ask you, I think you've already answered it, but it was to ask you about the statistics for the fatalities or the accidents that we've had due to non-English speaking persons. So I'm concerned about the stats, and I know you have to have had some type of stats to even to initiate this bill, to even beside maybe just hearing about accidents. And I'm saying this to you because I recently in Augusta there was an accident with my godchild who was hit by an immigrant, illegal immigrant that fled the scene. But when he was caught, he said that he didn't understand what the sign meant. He said, "No understand." But he hit her and broke both her legs. So I would just like to know, is there any stats anywhere that can be used to understand why we need to have this now? Is it an increase in deaths or the reason why we're bringing this bill forth now?
It's a good question. The problem is you can't gather those stats because it is interpreted as profiling if a policeman reports on his report non-English speaking individual. He has to report only what laws were violated and what he deems to have contributed or to have caused the wreck. And my bill does not address this, but there are numerous. I mean, this issue goes beyond the driver's license test. I could share with you stories about EMTs who tried to treat people in wrecks, and the patient simply couldn't tell them in English what needed to be done. And, was it their heart? Was it their right leg? Was it their left leg? Was it their right arm? But what this bill does, I think, is it moves our society and it raises a standard and a banner. And it says, we welcome everybody here. We're going to give you up to 10 years, if you're here on a visa, to learn how to take this test. And what Georgia already does is we provide a sample test on the Internet that you can take. You only have to get 75% of the questions right to pass the test. And so, you can memorize, but it points our society in a direction that I think is important, and a decision that this General Assembly made back in 1996, which was English is the official language of the state of Georgia.
Did that answer your question, Ms. Frazier? Representative Frazier. Representative Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to check and see if this was going to have any cost impact, any budgetary issues. Will it save money? Will it cost money to implement this?
I've been told that it's revenue neutral, that there's no cost. If anything, I think it would provide some savings because you would not be forced to print so many different tests in different languages. But that's going to be a very minimal savings, and that's a very good question. I think we ought to ask that question on every bill we vote on.
Thank you very much.
Representative Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One question I have, Representative Mills. If a person has a visa, then they are eligible to take the test in a language other than English. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And how well do they do with the signs, those people that own visa?
How well do they do that? Well, they have to pass 75% of the questions on the test in order to get a driver's license. So it's the same for everybody. I don't know the statistics on how well they do or how well they don't do, but it's the same standard. We treat everybody the same. You got to score 75 percentile to get your driver's license.
Thank you.
Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Mills, do you have any concerns in terms of the business impact that this might have as Georgia tries to compete on an international scale to attract and recruit businesses. Do you think that this sends a bad signal in that regard? The second question, would any federal dollars be impacted by this in terms of funding that goes towards limited English proficiency in those that are getting driver's license? And then the last question is, our state law currently accepts or is comfortable with drivers having English as a second language for up to 10 years. So what's the real rationale if somebody at 9 years, 364 days, we're comfortable with them driving? Why not on the 10th year? Why does that change?
Well, we're doing exactly what you're suggesting with your question. One of your questions was, you'll have to remind me, but one of them was, is this in opposition to businesses coming here? Certainly not. That's certainly a false statement that others have made. The bill would have never passed both chambers last year had that been the case. We heard the discussion raised about Kia and the Kia plant, but we had Kia plant operators who testified and who gave testimony that that was not the case. And if you're here legally and you have a legal visa and you pass the test with a 75 percentile or more, then you get a driver's license just like everyone else. And so for someone to say this is anti-business, matter of fact, let me just read to you. This is coming from the same group of folks. I'm reading right from one of their publications. They said, given the growing number of unlawful and bad business bills being proposed during this legislative session, this diverse group of business, and then it names off all these business people that have, and this actually I think comes from an Asian American group, and of course that is nothing further from the truth, and you can see how they try to create a smoke screen here when we have foreign companies coming in and testifying saying this bill doesn't hurt our business at all. I think that's the true litmus test.
The other question was, if the state is comfortable with these drivers for that period of 10 years, what changes on the 10th anniversary? Because their understanding, if whatever understanding they had, they were permitted to drive in the state for that 10-year period. Why, after that 10 year, do we want to change the rules?
I think we're just setting a standard and saying, hey, we're willing to go above and beyond. When this bill originally started, I think last year it may have only went to 6 years, and we expanded it to 10 years to try to say, hey, look, we're willing to go the second mile to work with anybody who's really trying to incorporate themselves into our society, and we want you to be moving toward English because we see it as a public safety issue.
Representative Yasmin Neal.
I just had another question. Grant, I offered one side of the debate. Another side, which I was thinking about, was being that it's not a matter of much cost because the written test is simply printing out sheets of paper, stapled together, that they reuse over and over again. And I guess it's kind of tapping on what Ms. Frazier spoke of. What is it? What is it that brought about wanting this only, the actual written portion only in the English language? Because, and when we speak in reference to the signs portion, there's no other option. You only have one English option for the signs. And it might be a matter of adding more sign possibilities as far as to the actual signage test to get a better grasp on the amount of English a person speaks. But what spawned this particular bill? What spawned the part about the written examination being in English? What brought that about?
Well, again, it's a public safety issue, and because we're no longer doing signs that just say cattle crossing up ahead or a school bus stop up ahead. I came down for the inauguration, like many of you did, on Sunday night because I knew the snowstorm was on the way. When I came down 85 South, all the signs were going strong, digital, across the expressway, and it was a parking lot, and people were leaving their cars on the expressway, walking down the road. But I had a sign, digital sign, that was telling me, slow down, wreck up ahead. If you can't read that, then you become not only a public safety to your problem to yourself, but those around you. And that's a perfect example of, and I think it's a modernization of where we're going to, is that it's not just signs printed on a 2x2 metal sign anymore. We now have digital signs, and it further elevates the issue of, and plus the fact that Georgia has said in the I believe it was 1996, we said as a General Assembly, English is going to be the official language of our state. We welcome everybody to come here legally. We don't discriminate. Everyone has the same chance. You have the same questions on your test. You have to pass the same percentile in order to get your driver's license. But we now, I think, want to say, hey, you need to be moving towards English, because that's where our society is operating with these digital signs.
Representative Mills, I don't see any further questions, but to go back to 1996, I believe that bill was through the General Assembly and signed before the 1996 Summer Olympics, if I'm correct.
You're right, and Mr. Chairman, and it was done with bipartisan support, just like this bill, except the only thing we've changed is I told you about the 10 years on page 2. Last year it had bipartisan support, and I'm hoping it'll have, well, first of all, I hope it makes it out of the committee. Second, with bipartisan support, and then I hope it moves forward with bipartisan support, because I'm interested in making good policy.
Well, there's no other questions at this time. I just ask that you kind of stay close by, and when we finish up, we'll get you back up.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
We have a few people signed up on this bill. I believe the first one is E.V. Howe. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
If you would, just let us know who you're representing, and we understand you may have comments, but try to keep them as concise and brief as possible.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chairman. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Ev Howe, retired Air Force, 21-year vet, Vietnam and Cold War, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you. I thought there were some really good questions, like why having the two for a visa and one for the permanent resident. Really, there shouldn't be any difference. I'd like to talk about myself. I like traveling. I've been all over the world. Usually all I need to drive anywhere in the world is a Georgia driver's license, believe it or not, or maybe an international driver's license. I do not fluently speak any other language besides English. I've driven in France, Germany, and French Polynesia, thankfully. And nobody's expressed the concerns that you've talked about. Nobody's expressed the concerns of the tourists that speak foreign languages, that rent a car and drive here in Georgia with an international license. They can't read probably those digital signs either. I lead English as a second language course at our church. Adults take a long time to master the nuances of reading questions, just like the person from the Department of Driving Safety said. But they can easily read the signs. And I could easily read the signs also in Quebec and France and Germany as far as the intent. But I couldn't read every word. And if someone can understand spoken English, then they have to be able to, how can they pass the actual driving experience with a Georgia evaluator? Excuse me, if he doesn't speak English, how can he pass the evaluation part of the driving test? You actually have a driving test. The evaluator tells you what to do. If you can do that, that's pretty good English. So why do we have this bill in Georgia? Without a driver's license, legal immigrants probably cannot get a job and drive to work. They'll be on welfare. It's going to cost you money. We have a lot of people here, refugees in our state. Foreign business owners are going to be a little bit leery about one of 9 states in the country that requires English only. That means 41 other states don't require English only for their tests. Governor Deal and now House Leader Ralston say they do not want bad for business, bad for Georgia bills. Why is this bill here in Georgia? I hope we can stop this annual bill request. I hope you will vote against it. It's not necessary. The tests are already created. Why go back and make us look really bad? Do not vote for HB 72. And this is a email I sent all of you. I hope you have it. I also had my speech that I gave to the Republican Immigration Reform Committee. And this is just, you know, you have to think about it. And some of you had really good questions. Why are we doing this? There's no real good reason for doing this. If I can drive all over the world with a Georgia license, why can't someone drive here after they take all the tests at the Georgia Driver's License Bureau and drive? Thank you. Any questions?
You do have one question. Representative Yasmin Neal.
Well, your statement just made me think of something else. I just wanted to clarify so that the board knows, being that I've worked there before, like I mentioned before, as far as the written test being the initial stage, and then you have the science tests and things like that. The driving portion is when you weed out the people that can speak and cannot speak English. So, because of course none of those, there might be a sporadic location that has a person that speaks Spanish or maybe even another language at that extent. But for the most part, most of the driver's examiners speak English, and even especially for me, if you didn't speak English and you didn't understand what I was doing, and we weren't looking good in the parking lot, we didn't go to the road. And even there have been times where I did have a person of another language that I was giving a test to. When we got to the road, it got dangerous. I had to stop the test. I had to drive us back myself, so it didn't pass. So just so people know on the board that there are different points where a person that can't speak English enough to drive on the road can be stopped, and that would be the road portion where it's at the discretion of the driver's examiner, just so you know that.
Absolutely. That's why we should not pass forward with this bill.
Representative Taylor.
I would like to make a comment about those here on a temporary visa, visiting tourists, things like that. I, too, have traveled abroad and driven abroad and have not had any problems. I think they still have that ability now. This is for a permanent, that someone is going to be here on a longer-term visa. They don't and are not expected to get a driver's license if they're here for a week to go to Stone Mountain. I mean, I want to make sure that's something I'm understanding correctly. This is if you're applying for a driver's license, not a temporary tourist visa.
Well, actually, after 30 days, you have to get a Georgia driver's license if you're here more than 30 days,
Okay.
even if you're a tourist.
Thank you.
Is that right? Anything else?
One more.
Fine.
Representative Billy Maddox.
Thank you. And I'd like to just thought of something as Representative Neal was talking about, that person who may not understand the English language, may not be their primary language, and things get, go from, not so good to really bad before you get on the road. And so you don't pass that driver. But if we're trying to set good policy for the state, if that person's a bad and dangerous driver because there's a communication barrier, then what's the fix? How's that person going to become a better driver? Is it? I submit, and I think that it's you familiarize yourself with the language that the road signs are in, and study that and be able to communicate that, and that's how you improve. I mean, if obviously I don't know if they go back and retest it in their same language and don't learn the signs that are in it, how does that person get better?
Signs are in English on the test, even on the foreign language test. You have to know the signs. And when we travel abroad, we make sure we know what the international signs are.
I understand picking out a picture of a sign and matching it up, but being able to read it and interpret it in English, isn't that two different things?
Well, most of them are basic, like one way, stop. You have a good idea. When you travel abroad, you make sure you know what one way is and stop. And also, most of the international signs do have a particular symbolism, like the octagon or whatever that is for the stop sign.
So your position would be that people that may or may not necessarily fully understand and comprehend the road signs on the roads that they're navigating poses no risk.
Oh, no, sir. Just like Representative Neal said, they have to pass the signage test. They have to be able to go on an oral exam with a driving examiner, and he has to be able to know what all the signs are. You know, they don't make an easy test. It's tough. A lot of people don't pass, even teenagers from the United States that are citizens.
But do you think because they don't pass and get that license that they're not driving?
Have you ever had a teenage? You're not old enough to have a teenage son or daughter. I've had them drive without a license, unfortunately. And of course, they've spent some time not driving for a long time after that, or not driving, but not going anywhere.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Wait, still got one more.
Oh,
Representative Yasmin Neal.
When Representative, and I can't think of his last name, in reference to what you think the fix is, I personally don't think the first test is the problem, nor the fix. I think the signs test is the fix. I think adding more to the sign portion is the fix. I don't think that the one that we're considering this bill is the fix for the problem that we're trying to address here. I think extending the signs portion and giving more people options, more updated options, because these are going to be outdated, more updated options as far as the digitized version of signs we have on the roads. I think that's the fix, me personally. If I were working in DDS still, I would fix that first before I mess with this one.
See, the reality, we have the written test in all the languages now. The thing we don't want is the image of us being one of 10 states that have English only, whereas 40 others don't. We want to be pretty reasonable, just like other countries are for us going to their countries.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Susan Pavlin.
Good afternoon. My name is Susan Pavlin, and I am an attorney that's practiced in Georgia for several years. I've represented some of the significant multinationals that have business here, and I currently work in the refugee population with people who are legal refugees here to this country that have started their lives in other countries and have been invited by our federal government to come to the United States and make new lives. Primarily because, well, exclusively because of persecution that they have already suffered that has driven them from their home countries. It's usually a persecution that is based on a dislike or a hatred of somebody's religion, of somebody's ethnicity, somebody's culture, somebody's social class, or somebody's politics. The people who are here in Georgia as refugees come from many countries around the world. Most recently, we've been receiving people from Iraq who have been supporters of the U.S. military over in Iraq. We've been seeing refugees coming in from countries such as Iran, where they have faced religious persecution. A good number of Christians have been persecuted by the government there. And also people who are survivors of ethnic genocide, people who are coming from countries like Burundi and Somalia and Rwanda, and Burma, authoritarian governments. I'm coming here today to express that I'm very concerned about this bill because it does nothing to improve, first of all, public safety or address immigration. As some of the representatives and other folks have already pointed out, immigration is clearly not an issue if you're getting a driver's license because you already have to prove that you're legally here. Representatives have also pointed out several public safety factors, or rather a lack of addressing public safety factors in this bill. In part, we know that and this is important for both a public policy decision, and it's also very important because this bill opens our state to liability and to judicial action because of its potential violation of both federal law and the United States Constitution. So when we look at the public policy issues, we know that there's no evidence that demonstrates that people who have limited English are causing a public safety problem. There's no documentation for that. We also know that the road sign tests, as been established, are in English, in fact, on the test, that you have to be able to meet that standard. And we also know that the exception for people who are illiterate or people who are not able to read and write English is in the bill. And I heard somebody say that in 1 year, 5,000 people were given licenses or at least took that test that way. I also know that in the AJC 2 years ago, there was an article that said 16% of Metro Atlanta's adults are not functionally literate as defined by being able to follow simple driving directions. So when you look at all of those factors and then combine them with the fact that somebody who's here on a visa for 10 years is considered a safe enough driver to get a driver's license, and yet 10 years and 1 day later, they are no longer safer to get a driver's license, you are establishing a law through this legislation that causes a significant public policy problem because it is not, in fact, having any impact on safety that can be documented or established. As I said, that's important because it can be costly to litigate these issues. The federal government and others can file suit, and generally suits that go all the way up through the Supreme Court, which is likely in a case that deals with constitutionality and discrimination under the Civil Rights Act, can be very costly, often running into the millions of dollars. We're also concerned, and going to Representative Holcomb's question earlier that I don't think got addressed, that this bill could endanger funding that comes into the state of Georgia. Under the current executive order and interpretation of the Civil Rights Act and the provisions against non-discrimination for national origin, if we do not allow the people who have the right to take the exam access in a language that they can use, we're opening our state to not only the lawsuits and the discrimination suits, but also to a discontinuation of Department of Transportation funding. So that is something that concerns me quite a bit in terms of the budget and the work that would have to be done in the state. Finally, we know that about 60,000 people in Georgia currently are taking the written driver's test in a language other than English. They are going on and they are getting licenses, and they are able to use those licenses for that 10 years. But again, on 10 years and 1 day, they suddenly may not be able to. This law could take away people's ability to meet basic elements of self-sufficiency, basic elements of getting to work, being able to support their own families. And that is a serious concern because I don't want to put more people on welfare in our state. Refugees in particular, it is true that there is some time frame that they can get a temporary license as this law is drafted. But we also know that the average adult takes at least 7 years to learn to read and write at a decent level of proficiency that would be required for this exam. And we know that refugees in particular are people who have been persecuted, they have been tortured in some cases, they are suffering from trauma. Some may be not literate in their own language, which delays the ability to learn to read and write relatively quickly. And as a result, there really are going to be people who are making every effort they possibly can to become self-sufficient, to become good Americans, to be citizens even in this country, and yet who will have their livelihood taken away from them because they didn't learn a new language fast enough. These are the concerns that I have about this bill, and I would urge you to both consider them and to oppose the bill.
You do got a question. Representative Billy Horn.
I just have one question. If this bill is potentially unconstitutional and against federal law, then why is it that the other 9 states' laws haven't been overturned yet?
I would have to take a look at the way they were phrased and what the situation is in each state to answer that question. What I do know is that the Civil Rights Act requires that if someone is eligible for a federally funded government service, then they must be provided that service in a culturally and linguistically competent way, and that's under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, and it's also supported by the U.S. Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause. Under federal executive order, a presidential order from 2007, that provision was interpreted to apply to all of the various federal departments and all of the state entities that receive federal funds. So I do know, and to the extent that there's ever been any kind of balancing on equal protection issues, in order to win an equal protection exception, in other words, to single out people who are, I think you were saying that people with visas who are coming here, excuse me, I'm sorry, people who are born in Georgia and grew up here who maybe don't know how to read and write are somehow different than people who weren't born here but maybe even have lived here for 10 years and had a license. So when you're singling out a particular group at that 10 years and one day, in order to justify that under an equal protection argument, you would have to demonstrate public safety concerns that are documented and that can be shown. And I don't think that we come even close today in this conversation of being able to meet that standard.
I don't have a question, but I will make a comment real quick just for the committee. In the past, the Georgia Supreme Court has ruled and upheld English-only rule, and it was an implied consent on a DUI case. So it has been upheld in the state of Georgia, so I just want to point that out to the committee if you weren't familiar with that. But I do not see any other questions, and appreciate your time, ma'am.
Thank you.
Jerry Gonzalez.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Jerry Gonzalez. I am Executive Director of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials. At Galeo, we focused on enhancing and increasing civic engagement and leadership development of the Latino community all across this great state of ours. Let's be very clear. This bill is the reincarnation of the Kia Go Home bill. This bill is bad for Georgia's image and bad for Georgia's business efforts. This bill does specifically target legal immigrants and U.S. citizens with limited English proficiency. Representative Mills brings no public safety data or testimony for public safety officials to back up his claims that this is a very significant public safety concern. If this was a very significant public safety concern, it is incumbent upon Representative Mills to bring forth data to prove his point, yet he offers none. He doesn't appreciate false statements, yet he comes up here and he tells you that Kia employees testified opposing or supporting this type of legislation, and that's simply not the case because we've been attending hearings associated with this type of bill ever since it's been introduced. So that has not been the case, and in fact, there was a front page article written in a Korean paper that was distributed at the Kia plant that said, "Kia, go home," because of this legislation that failed last couple of sessions as well. So this is a message that the international community is looking at. Several national Asian American groups and Latino groups have weighed in strongly against this type of English-only initiative. So that should be a concern to this committee. Again, there is no backup data for his claim that this is a public safety issue. And if there is no data, then I'm sorry, I do have to call it for what it is. This is an anti-immigrant bill at its face. With the exemptions for illiterate people and the exemption for the 10-year temporary license and then 10-year plus 1 day, then they're no longer, they're to be considered a public safety hazard. All of that undermines any kind of public safety considerations that Representative Mills is making. The public safety considerations are a facade. They're a smokescreen, and they're not the real reason that Representative Mills is bringing this forward. If it was a public safety issue, then people that are illiterate, people that don't know English and are issued these temporary licenses, then they shouldn't be issued a driver's license. Of course, I don't advocate for that. I would advocate for maintaining what we have right now, as Representative Neal has suggested. During the driving exam, clearly there is an indication and a possibility to stop a dangerous driver from going forward. So there is no public safety data that Representative Mills presents, and it is not a public safety issue. Potentially, this bill would violate the Civil Rights Act, as was already indicated, and would potentially endanger DOT funding. Can the state afford to risk losing any federal funding? Are we dealing with a massive budget crunch here? We need to think fiscally responsible solutions for our state as we move forward with these types of legislation. The business community in Alabama and Tennessee strongly oppose this issue as an economic development issue. They opposed it as an economic development issue because they didn't want to position their states to be at a competitive disadvantage in a global marketplace. As state legislators, as the General Assembly, you need to consider how we're positioning Georgia to compete in a global marketplace and how we position ourselves to be welcoming to the international community. This bill will send a wrong message to the international community that they are not welcome here. This is not good for Georgia. This bill is the Kia Go Home bill. We'll continue to call it the Kia Go Home bill because exactly it is the message that you're sending to the international community. And we would urge you to vote no on Representative Mills' bill. Thank you.
Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wendell Phillips.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that all the questions, concerns, and areas to be covered have been covered by other speakers, so I would wait.
Well, I'm going to say thank you very much.
I'll be back, though.
Phil Kent.
Hello, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to testify on HB 72. My name is Phil Kent, and I'm a Georgia resident, and I'm also a board member of a national organization called Pro English, which is dedicated to making English as the official language of the United States and also the official language of government, all the 50 states. Interestingly, Georgia is one of 31 states that have official English laws. There's a lot of misinformation about that. There is no national official language, but 31 states have English as the official language of government. I think that's very important. And I think it's very important for the committee to realize that this loophole with our driver's license tests is in violation of the law you passed in 1996 that Representative Mills referenced a few minutes ago. So I think it's a loophole that has to be closed to get in line with your official English law. And interestingly enough, the 1996 law states that not only is English designated as the official language of the state of Georgia, but it shall be the language used for each public record, each public meeting, and for official acts of the state of Georgia, including those governmental documents, records, meetings, actions, or policies which are enforceable with the full weight and authority of the state of Georgia. And as has been said before, the driver's license exams are given in 14 different languages: Arabic, Bosnian, Cambodian, Chinese, English, French, German, Japanese, Korean, Laotian, Polish, Russian, Spanish, and Vietnamese. A clear safety hazard has been pointed out by Representative Mills and others. Unfortunately, most American motorists, at least those who speak English, are unaware of the safety on American roads and highways as being sacrificed for the sake of accommodating some notion of diversity. As you know, and has been pointed out, all of the highway warning and hazard signs in Georgia are written in English, so it's easy to understand the danger posed by drivers who cannot reach English. I actually have some statistics from the state of Georgia that highlights this growing problem. I cite the New York Times of December 9th, 2010. a little over a month ago. It was a very interesting feature story. The sources were from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and from the Gwinnett County Sheriff's Department right here in Georgia. The whole feature story was about unlicensed drivers and fatal crashes. And I'd be happy to give this to you, Chairman Bearden, after my testimony. It is true there are no precise statistics on illegal immigrants who drive, but the government does compile information on the license status and ethnicity of drivers killed in accidents. Here's a Gwinnett County snapshot as reported by the New York Times. In Gwinnett County, immigrants arrested for unlicensed driving are being detained for deportation under the federal 287G law. We've read about that a lot in Georgia the last few years. A disproportionate share of those detained under this program are Hispanic and are illegal. In fact, if you look at the chart that's in the New York Times, it has a chart saying drivers killed in crashes who were unlicensed. In Gwinnett County, 51% are Hispanic who are driving illegally. That's a disgrace. It's a snapshot of what's going on here in Georgia. As we know, Georgia has far more illegal immigrants than even the state of Arizona, where we see a lot of controversy. I think that's a very damning statistic. It's something obviously you as public lawmakers and public policymakers ought to consider when you're looking, and that's one of the reasons why I do support this law, this bill into becoming law. Various state and municipal governments are taking matters into their own hands, introducing laws requiring the driver's license applicants to pass the tests in English. Most recently, Oklahoma took action to require these driver's license exams to be given in English after a couple requested that their driver's license exam be administered in Farsi. After the state of Oklahoma refused, the couple sued. And then Oklahoma responded by passing something very similar to what Representative Mills is offering. It passed the House and the Senate in that state by overwhelming bipartisan margins, was signed into law by a Democrat governor, Brad Henry, and it went into effect just this last October. Another state doing that. The couple's lawsuit ultimately motivated Oklahoma to pass legislation to put the question on the November ballot that would amend the Constitution to make English its official language. It passed overwhelmingly in the state of Oklahoma, 76%, the highest margin of all the ballot questions. And so that's why, Mr. Chairman, I think the citizens of Georgia have good reasons to support requiring this bill. I think that you could look at a couple news stories and find out exactly, and I appreciate what Representative Maddox had to say earlier, to appreciate some of the horrible stories of people killed. I saw one and I won't bore you with a lot, but I saw one in December of 2003 in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette that I've always kept. It was a truck driver who could not understand English. He ran into and killed an entire family of 5. The driver couldn't read a warning sign banning trucks over 10 tons on the road he was traveling. His truck weighed 40 tons. Horrible accident. I could go on. You know, even the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration regulations, which govern motor carriers engaged in interstate commerce, require drivers to, quote, read and speak the English language sufficiently to converse with the general public, to understand highway traffic signs and signals in the English language, to respond to official inquiries, and to make entries on reports and records. If reading and speaking English is required for driver's safety in interstate commerce, it also should be the standard for the state of Georgia and its motorists. Non-English speaking drivers not only endanger themselves, as we see from the Gwinnett County example, they endanger emergency personnel. That was alluded to a little earlier, Mr. Chairman. And I saw in one newspaper, the Enterprise in Alabama, a rescuer tried to warn a Massachusetts man who could not speak English that his car was on fire and barely got to him to leave before the car was engulfed in flames. So there is an emergency personnel factor here. Our neighbor Tennessee is currently considering the same type of legislation that Representative Mills has introduced, and with regard to the driver's license exam. In testimony that's going on there right now, law enforcement officers are saying that they've been sitting on the interstate for hours waiting for interpreters, state troopers to drive down from neighboring cities, and they have to wait for an additional interpreter to book the non-English speaking person into jail. You know, one thing that hasn't been touched on either, Mr. Chairman, is that foreign language driver's license tests exams invite fraud. Giving the driver's license exams in foreign languages obviously increases the risks of cheating and makes it very difficult to prevent or detect fraud. The Denver Post reported in February of 2005, federal agents uncovered a Department of Motor Vehicles ring in Colorado, which they accused of using foreign language driver's license test to put hundreds of illegal aliens behind the wheels of heavy trucks and cars. The mastermind of the ring said he would sit next to the applicants who did not speak English and pose as a translator while giving test takers answers to the test questions he had memorized. This has also gone on in other states. I won't bore you with other stories about that. The multilingual driver's tests, remember, we're in 14 languages here in Georgia. These tests create legal loopholes that obviously frustrate law enforcement. There's been a troubling trend in the courts in recent years, beginning to overturn DUI convictions in cases in which violators are not given breathalyzer instructions and warnings in their native language. I've talked to some state court judges in the metro Atlanta area about this. They say the same thing. The courts have ruled that allowing drivers to take licensing tests in their native languages creates an obligation for states to issue traffic warnings and citations in the same language. Do we want to go down that route? Listen to what happened in New Jersey last July. The New Jersey Supreme Court incredibly ruled that police must inform drunk driving suspects in their native language that they are legally required to take a breathalyzer test. In 2007, German Marquise was involved in a two-car accident. The New Jersey police suspected him of driving under the influence, read him a statement that explained he had to take a breath test. He didn't consent because he didn't speak English. He was convicted of driving while intoxicated for refusing to take a breath test. He appealed the conviction. Listen to this. He appealed the conviction of driving while intoxicated and refusing to take the breath test, saying that the explanation about the law should have been given in Spanish. He wanted the court to overturn his conviction and mandate translations of his breath test statement. The court agreed 4-3. The court overturned the conviction until that day, no state had required translation of the statement for non-English speakers. This is the trend that's going on, Mr. Chairman, in America, and that's why I'm glad that this legislation is being considered here as a protection. It's I want to reiterate some things that have been said before. The bill simply requires that all permanent residents take their written driver's license tests in English. This Kia business is nonsense. The bill does not apply to those here on temporary visas for the first 10 years. That's been stated over and over again. I don't know how many times the proponents of this bill have to say that. The people who have their own political agendas are just going to misinterpret that or lie about it. It honors driver's licenses of international business executives, tourists, and foreign students. The people of Georgia, in my opinion, and I really believe this, need HB 72 because it would end the confusing and dangerous multilingualism that is creeping up not only in this state and this country. And, you know, it reaffirms the melting pot tradition that served this state so well and has served our country so well. I have to also vehemently take issue with these misinterpretations and myths and lies by some of these people who claim that it's unconstitutional. None of these 9 states that have these English driver's license tests have ever been sued by any Justice Department. In fact, it's not unconstitutional. National origin and language have never been ruled upon by the Supreme Court of the United States, so anyone telling you differently is not telling you the truth. There has been an executive order. It was one issued by Bill Clinton in 2000. And we argued this in Senator Murphy's committee last year, and we argued it the year before the House. You remember that, Mr. Chairman. That this executive order does not have the force of a full federal law. And again, we have not seen even the Obama Justice Department make any moves in this direction against any of the 9 states that have this. And we have not actually seen really much any movement in any of the 31 states that have had official English laws. You know, about 10, 15 years ago, virtually no states had official English and government laws. And I'm proud to be a member of an organization that has been working in this area just to safeguard all of us. And again, it's the tie that binds, again, on our own Georgia state law. We have English in government, as I started at the beginning of my remarks, and I think that this loophole ought to be closed. I do remind everyone, especially some new lawmakers or folks that are not familiar with what has happened over the last 2 years, this legislation has been around. It's been vetted and perfected, in my opinion, for the last 2 years. And it has been pointed out by the bill's author that time just simply ran out last year. I remember it. I know some of you remember it. There were several bills as the midnight hour struck that could not get done. They had been basically all set to go. And so this is why we're back again this year. Mr. Chairman, thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I believe you got two. Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kent, some of the examples that you gave in support during your testimony were with respect to illegal immigration and to unlicensed drivers with respect to the New York Times story. By my reading of the bill, neither of those issues are addressed in this bill. Is that correct?
Yes, but I'm also going to probably throw out to you the fact that in the same New York Times story, some of these drivers had fake documentation and fake licenses.
Does this bill address that issue?
No, it doesn't, but I'm giving you a snapshot of people who don't understand English. That was the point of me bringing it up. These are non-English speakers, according to the Gwinnett County Sheriff's Department. I just thought it would be of interest to the committee.
Thanks.
Now, as has been pointed out, properly so, officers just write up reckless driving. That's basically what's done in all 50 states.
Representative Yasmin Neal.
In reference to the article you referenced, I think it mildly kind of contradicts the point you may be trying to prove, because you were stating about it just mentioned unlicensed drivers. It didn't make a mention of drivers who had went to who had taken the proper steps, went to a driver service center, tried for test, proved or disproved they knew English or not. This is just the article you're referencing just simply addresses somebody that could very well be an illegal immigrant that had no intention and has never had intention of getting a license, just driving. I don't think it addresses what we're talking about here, which is persons who are trying for a test.
Well, you can talk to the Gwinnett County Sheriff Butch Conway about that. The article does state, and I have to sometimes chuckle about this when we talk about undocumented people that the New York Times article talks about. They're the most documented people in the world. The only trouble is it's all fake. And so many of these people have fake licenses. I just thought it was an interesting snapshot with regard to people who do not know English or know English well. This is occurring right here in Gwinnett County with regard to accidents.
Well, I guess I'm trying to explain the fact that these aren't people who are trying for a license. Does that make any sense?
Well, if they're granted amnesty under the DREAM Act, if they're granted any type of amnesty, which is currently now under serious discussion, it's been under serious discussion since 2006, these people will be on a path to citizenship. So I think you ought to be very cognizant of what's going on in Gwinnett County, because if you follow anything on national policy levels, you'll know that perhaps these people could be given amnesty and then they could be driving on our roads.
I just wanted to make two more comments. When you reference persons, like in reference to the persons taking tests and getting licenses when people are cheating and sitting next to them, I don't know if that's a problem dealing with the bill either. I think that's more so of a problem within that department as far as management, and if they didn't have the proper personnel, like in my agency, you didn't take a test with someone next to you. That didn't happen. And
all I'm saying, it's easier to commit fraud. You would agree with that?
That's, like I said, it's not an issue of the bill. It's an issue of it being in that department and the problem at the department level. You don't agree, though, that different multilingual tests would foster fraud?
Time out here just a second.
Go ahead.
The representative will ask a question and we'll respond with an answer, but we're not going to go back with questions back and forth. Okay. And if you don't mind, let me break in. We may agree to disagree on certain issues here, but we will be respectful to everybody that testifies, and especially this committee members up here. We've gotten close a couple times during this committee. So we're going to be respectful. If the representative asks a question, we're going to answer the question, and we're not going to have questions back and forth. So go ahead with your question, Representative Hill.
Oh, I just wanted to speak a little bit about in reference to the reference to like a particular issue given in reference to the bill itself. That was my concern.
I totally do not understand your question.
Let me see. I was trying to elaborate on the question about the example you gave in reference to our bill, as far as, I guess, using that as proof of different elements in the bill.
Which example are you talking about?
The one about the persons taking the test and them not being supervised properly and then cheating and things of that nature occurring.
Well, you are aware there was a scandal here in our own department a few years ago with regard to fraud and the taking of the exams. So I might agree with you that it might be an internal problem, but all I'm saying is that this could foster fraud. That's all I'm simply saying.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Yeah.
Representative Cook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kent, is it not true that this bill pretty much just meets the common sense test? If we're driving on the roads here in Georgia, all of our signage is in English. I was just looking at this copy that we have right here. There's tons of them. One in particular says yield to oncoming traffic. That's pretty specific, and that could definitely pose a safety issue. So would you not agree with me that it literally is a public safety issue and it's a common sense test? I mean, that this bill will satisfy.
Well, I do agree with that. It is common sense, and all of you have the number of signs, and I think it is very disturbing if people cannot understand these signs. So, yes, sir.
Representative, he waves. Thank you. Representative Neal.
Sorry. I just wanted to clarify for the board, when a person gets a test English or another language, it's a much bigger version of this. This is exactly what they see, not this document here, but it's a much bigger and more elaborate version of this right here. They actually get a sign in front of them that is on the streets of Georgia for that test. And it's a pass or fail kind of deal, just so you know that.
Is that a question?
I think that's a comment to the committee there. I don't see any other questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Skip.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Last one, Frank McCahey, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Frank Mulcahy. I'm Executive Director of the Georgia Catholic Conference. The Georgia Catholic Conference represents the Catholic bishops of Georgia. And I'm not going to repeat some of the things we have heard, but I think we need to respond to some of them. The first point I think I need to make is, I don't know if Representative Mills is still here. Oh, there he is. All right. Representative Mills is still here. I just want to say to the members of the committee that I've been privileged to work with Representative Mills on a number of different bills over the years. And I just want him to know that although we're going to disagree on this legislation, I have all the respect in the world for him. And if anyone has been accusing him of whatever they're accusing him of, it's not been us. One of the things that we think is very important, and I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, you're raising this point, that these are issues of public policy over which we may disagree. But if we are going to be attacking each other and making attacks against people, then we're not going to come to a good solution. And that's one of the reasons why we do oppose this bill, because one of the foundations of our teaching is the human dignity of each and every human being in the world. This foundational teaching. And we will oppose any legislation which is going to appear to demean people. And as I said, I don't think that that was Mr. Mills' intention. Unfortunately, some of our speakers have gone beyond his intention and to bring in issues of immigration and immigrants and terms like those people. These are terms which we have a real problem with, because I don't think this is what public policy is all about. With that, let me say I appreciate Ms. Pavlin's statement. As maybe the members of the committee know, the Archdiocese of Atlanta and the Diocese of Savannah are under contract with the federal government to bring in refugees and asylees from around the world who come in here in a short period of time, try to learn our language and learn our way of doing things and become independent. That must happen under federal guidelines. Now you're going to say, well, do they learn English? I mean, those of us who have studied Latin, studied Greek, studied those languages, may be able to move into the Romance languages, but I know it. Particularly when I was in Vietnam, I remember the difficulty of learning a language which is totally divorced from the Romance languages. We see that on the opposite coming in here. People from the Sudan, we know what's going on in the Sudan today. People from parts of Asia, from Iraq. Now, I'll say again, I was in Vietnam. I worked with civilian people who were probably dead because they supported the United States. These are the people we bring to this state. And the state has always welcomed them, and I think it's important that they get the opportunity to drive and get a permanent license. I haven't seen the final language of the bill, but I'm just trying to understand it. Mr. Kent mentioned the motor carrier safety regulations. I spent several years as a regulator of motor carrier safety for the federal government, and those regulations are much more complex than street signs, and there's a real reason for that requirement that they speak English. Finally, I think it was Ms. Neal or Mr. Holcomb who raised the question of emergency personnel. You know, this is an issue we are addressing, trying to help people learn English as a second language. We are turning people away who want to learn English as a second language. If I were going to make a proposal, it is that we need to be putting more money into this. That's going to help protect the safety. But that, of course, is beyond the scope of this bill. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your time. I appreciate your bringing me up here as the last witness. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Well, I did not see any questions on the screen.
All right. Thank you, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you very much. Representative Mills, I'll bring you up for the closing argument, but let you make a few remarks, and if there's any questions of the committee, then we'll move forward to see what the pleasure of the committee is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'll be brief. I just want to say that, you know, I understand the importance of, we want to say and send a message that you're welcome to come to Georgia. That's the greatest state in the United States. I could live anywhere. I choose to live here because of that. And the church I go to, we teach English as a second language. We have a Hispanic mission that meets within our church simultaneously. We offer citizenship classes, of which I taught 2 weeks ago in. We also have participated in the refugee mission project that's at Clarkston, if you're familiar with refugees. We go there and we try to reach out to them. So I just say that to say to this committee, this bill has nothing to do with that, in my opinion, or else I would not be involved in those things that I just mentioned. What it does have to do with is it says we want to raise a standard in Georgia. English is our official language. And because of that, we believe that the test should be administered in English. We're going to give you up to 10 years if you're here legal and you're on a visa to be able to come to terms with that. I think that is really going the second mile. And I would ask the members of this committee for their affirmative vote and hope that we could move it forward, Mr. Chairman.
You do have one question, Chairman Talton.
Oh, that was a question to you. I'm sorry.
Okay. Go ahead.
At proper time, I'll make a motion.
Okay. Is there any other questions to the author of the bill? Seeing none at this time. Was that not the question to?
I'm sorry.
Representative Neal.
Just a matter of clarification. I do understand both sides of it, of the argument. But just throwing race out of the window, just your honest, downhearted, personal opinion. Do you think this test, this particular bill, this particular test, do you think this is the problem? Do you think this is the root of the problem? Is there another way that this can be addressed aside from this particular testing as far as these other languages? Is this the problem? Does that make any sense, the question? your opinion, is this the problem, or is there another way to address this in a way where that particular test isn't affected?
Well, we don't live in a perfect world, of course, and I do believe this is the best way to address it. That's why I authored the bill and present it to the committee. If the committee can improve upon it, I'm all for making better policy. The difficulty that I think we have are these digital signs.
Okay.
How do you come up with a test that includes every possible scenario of digital signage that we now have before us?
Okay.
Chairman Talton, now is the proper time.
Mr. Chairman, at this time, I make a motion that this House Bill 72 passes as is in its form.
The substitute to House Bill 72.
Substitute, yeah.
Just so everyone knows, it's LC number 352060S. We have a motion. Do we have a second? We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, raise your right hand. All those opposed, raise your right hand. 8 votes to 2 in favor. Congratulations, Mr. Mills. You're ready to go to the Rules Committee. Before we break, I do want to say thank you to the committee for your time today, for the good questions and the hard work. We will be meeting next Wednesday at 2 p.m. I believe we will have 4 bills on the schedule at that time. And this meeting's adjourned. Thank you all very much.